A desert canyon where fortunes were made and fates were sealed.
There's not much here besides desert and rock. What would draw people here? Well, in these remote, inhospitable locations, the answer is usually the same: money.
A mighty clifftop complex on the island of Malta.
It was damp, it was dark, it was like being in a cell in many ways. But things would have been much worse in battle.
A rural area in Poland that once connected the world.
A lot of the electronics are still here. This 2-megawatt transmitter, I mean, it's just unheard of. That's enough to power a small town.
And an island fortress in Scotland with a dramatic backstory.
It was armed to the teeth with guns, cannon, and anti-air defense. But all these guns were useless against the main threat of that time.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. The wilds of Nevada, USA. In a hostile desert are the haunting remains of a settlement.
This place is only a 45-minute drive from Las Vegas, but it feels like 1,000,000 miles away from the casinos, the bright lights, and the glamour.
I mean, you can see that there are a number of man-made structures around this, some large tanks, there's bits of machinery.
Old wooden buildings are echoes of the 19th century, but scattered around are remnants of the 20th.
There's this rusting, old abandoned truck, a crashed plane. This place looks like it's trapped in some type of time warp.
This is a wild place. If the climate doesn't get you, then nature will. Humans were never designed to live in a place like this.
The place is filled with decaying machinery. But what was it all for?
If you're going to go to somewhere so extreme, you have to be drawn by something. And usually in places like this, it's something to do with what's in the ground.
This entrance had been covered up for 80 years, but when we popped into this thing, there's a half a mile of tunnel in here that nobody had been in for years and years.
People came here to make their fortunes. But for some, life would turn out very differently.
There's 9 different levels in here. There's 3 miles of tunnels, and it goes 600 feet deep.
Tony Worley first came to the tunnels 25 years ago. They were dug as part of a search for a precious mineral.
This is an extremely hard rock. This is like number 7 hard from 1 to 10. This is the 7, which is stronger than cement.
To come here, you need a pretty good reason. And in the most extreme locations like this, that's usually to make money.
What they were looking for was not only hard, but glistening white.
This is vein. You can see it runs from here all the way over into here. You just see it's running up the mountain.
The white rock here would be the source of untold wealth. The first person to recognize its value was a man called John Moss.
John Moss was your classic frontiersman. They really should be making movies about this guy.
He was the first non-native to descend the Colorado River rapids by raft. He spent 3.5 days being drenched, ducked, and pounded by the river as he traveled through the Grand Canyon.
Originally from Utica, New York, Moss was on an expedition into Western America.
He apparently had a real gift for languages, and he spent a lot of time traveling around with almost 24 different Native American tribes, which allowed him to immerse himself in their culture.
Moss was drawn to Nevada by rumors about that strange white rock in the mountains. He suspected it was quartz, a mineral that forms in veins when hot magma interacts with groundwater.
Quartz is SiO2, it's silica. It's one of the most abundant minerals on the planet. It can occur in certain different ways as these veins, rich in silica, but rich in other minerals like lead, zinc, silver, and sometimes gold.
Moss analyzed the mineral, and his hunch was confirmed. This is El Dorado Canyon, home to the richest gold deposits in southern Nevada.
Once the miners found this white quartz vein, they never left track of it. They just keep it in sight, and so they'll chase it wherever it goes.
As you go into the mountain, the geology changes. Maybe your vein suddenly goes off on a different angle. So you'd follow that if that's where the potential resource was.
However, following the trail of quartz was only the first part of a complicated process.
It's important to note here, they're not finding big gold nuggets. In this situation, a lot of the gold is small particles in the veins.
Carts filled with quartz were pulled out of the tunnels. But extracting gold from it was not only expensive, but potentially deadly.
You have to crush this rock up as fine as you can, all the way down to the texture of flour.
The crushed quartz was then mixed with a very toxic chemical.
It would mix it in these big cyanide tanks here, and the cyanide would pull the microscopic pieces of gold and silver out of the ore.
But with high risk came big rewards. El Dorado was making money hand over fist.
The gold mining that took place in El Dorado Canyon is phenomenal. About $200 million worth of gold and silver came out of that mine.
For every ton of quartz, 28 grams of gold was extracted. But the greater challenge was getting the gold out of El Dorado.
Everything has to be shipped in by water, trucked up the canyon through the Colorado River.
In the mid-1800s, there was only one port in the canyon. It was a small dock on the river called Nelson's Landing.
But despite the harshness of the conditions, despite the difficulty in getting the supplies there, what's being produced is so valuable that you actually get pretty heavy traffic in and out of the canyon. And Nelson's Landing turns out to be one of the busiest transition points for supplies in the whole region.
Cut off from law-abiding society, El Dorado eventually became a hotbed of criminal activity. At a time when much of the US was under prohibition, here there was a thriving black market.
It's said that the alcohol produced there for, pennies was actually sold for up to $1 a gallon just across state lines.
Nelson's Landing had turned into a pirate's bay.
Back in the late 1800s, El Dorado Canyon was one of the most violent and lawless places in America.
Yeah, it's a bad place to be. In the 1880s, not even a killing is a good enough reason to bring the sheriff out here, 200 miles away. He tells them they have to fend for themselves out here.
Local miner John Riggs later wrote, "I never think there was another place in proportion to the population where so many murders were committed and the perpetrators never brought to justice or even apprehended."
Greed, vice, and murder made El Dorado Nevada's first sin city. But it wasn't the arrival of the law that eventually brought it down.
When World War II started, all the miners that worked at the mine went to war. This vein right here is where they were when they left. When they came back from World War II, they never opened this mine again.
It's said that $1 million in gold was left in the El Dorado mine. But nowadays, it would cost $2 million to dig it out. The mine has been silent for 80 years, but the wrecks of military vehicles are signs that the drama here continued in a different way.
Hollywood came to El Dorado to film 3,000 Miles to Graceland. Big names, a big budget, car chases, and a crashed plane. But it was a bomb. But good film or bad film, the legacy remains, and we see it before us now.
Hidden in plain sight on the southeast coast of Malta, a great complex stands guard over the shore.
You've got these azure seas, rocky, sandy beaches. You've got these tall cliffs rising out of the sea.
And as your eye follows these rocky cliffs, your eye suddenly realizes that you're not looking at a cliff anymore. Look at those bars on the windows. If I didn't know any better, I'd think this is a place designed to lock up the most desperate criminals.
It has a almost prison-like quality. And yet, given its placement right on this important coastline, that argues that this is probably a fort.
Viewed from above, the distinctive features confirm that this place was built for defense.
Here we can see elements of a fortress that date back years, but we also see elements that are clearly modern, that are clearly meant to withstand 20th century weapons.
I mean, think about all the Greek, Italian, Spanish islands that aren't fortified. Why is this island fortified? It must have some real strategic importance.
It was once preparing to face a colossal naval assault. But who was the enemy? And did those inside live to tell the tale? The story here dates back to the 19th century, when Malta was under British rule. Matthew Balzan is a local historian who has made detailed studies of the complex.
Here we are in tunnels below the main site, which run all the way across. From outside, one would not realize what lies beneath here.
Although most of what remains above ground was built later, the original defenses here were hidden from view.
Here we are seeing an example of a 12.5-inch, 38-ton rifle muzzle-loading gun. The time when it was put in place here in 1880 was the largest example of rifle muzzle-loading technology the British Army had at its disposal. Comparing it to the size of a human being, one can immediately realize the sheer size of such artillery. What's more interesting about these examples is that these are the last remaining examples in the whole world where we still see the original gun on its original carriage and platform in their original locations.
This represents the acme of gun technology at the time. It's rifled, meaning it can fire accurately at a much longer range, more penetrating power, fires a bigger shell with far greater accuracy. Its purpose is to kind of spar and jab with assaulting fleets.
But one of these guns alone would not have been enough. As the many openings in the cliff suggest, half a dozen of them were once trained upon the horizon.
One can just imagine the sound which would be created when a gun of this size would be fired. To give just a small example, a gunpowder cartridge, when fired inside the chamber of this gun, would expand in volume 20,000 times. And all of that has to go out in smoke and noise.
Located just a few miles south of the capital city of Valletta is Fort Delamara.
The British, they learned some valuable lessons from Malta's past. They learned, for example, that it's not enough to fortify the grand harbor around Valletta. You have to always fortify this secondary harbor, Marsaslaks, at the end of the island. What had happened previously is everybody had left Marsaslaks undefended, and powers like the French had just sailed in there, offloaded their amphibious forces, and taken the island essentially through the back door. So what you see the British doing in the 19th century is pouring millions into these new fortifications in this secondary harbor, the Marsaslag harbor.
Once again, it was the French who were threatening to attack. But now, the fort was ready for them.
These massive guns were put here because this was a desperately sensitive spot for the Royal Navy to defend.
Moats on the landward sides protected it to the rear, but the real key to defeating an invasion force was the invaluable element of surprise.
The fortifications are deliberately small and almost invisible from the sea. They're low profile, they're pushed up, they're built out of the bedrock, so they blend into the actual hill itself, into the cliffs.
In the olden days, you'd build tall walls to keep people out. But in the gunpowder age, you've got to build low walls that are hard to see and that are thick and backed up with earth. This is a fortress designed to be effective against modern assault. This is the very model of modern military architecture.
In the end, the invasion force didn't come, and the guns were never fired at French ships. But the threat remained, and in time, a new enemy and a new threat emerged.
From the 1870s, when the British start building this fort and start adding artillery, they are continually upgrading the artillery as there's changes in casting techniques, metallurgy, shell construction.
Here was the final upgrade to the fort's artillery. A 6-inch breech-loading gun, which was installed here in 1938 in preparation for what would become the Second World War.
The British had spent decades preparing for an attack on Malta, and now it seemed imminent. The main target was this harbor.
The British military had to be prepared in case of enemy action. In fact, this gun would go on to be fired in anger during the same conflict.
In June 1940, Italy joined the war on the side of the Axis powers. But she had ambitions that spread well beyond Europe.
Malta emerges early on in World War II as a place of, great strategic importance. Why? Because Italy and then Germany are trying to conquer North Africa.
Under the leadership of Erwin Rommel, known famously as the Desert Fox, the Axis powers invaded North Africa as part of a plan to seize the valuable oil fields there. The fighting was fierce and bloody, and the Allied bases on Malta were to be of vital importance.
If Rommel, the great German tank general, had been able to blast through from North Africa to take the Caucasus, to meet up with German forces in the Caucasus, then the Nazis would have had the oil, the resources they needed to keep on fighting, and maybe to keep the war going a long time, maybe even to win the Second World War.
But for the Italians and the Germans to communicate with North Africa, to resupply their armies, they have to be able to freely cross the Mediterranean. And they're attacked in this by the RAF and by the Royal Navy, which are based in Malta. One of the most damaging raids by the British on Axis communications happens in September 1941, when the British, using their code breaking at Bletchley Park, they learn of this convoy, they put submarines right out in its path, they sink 2 of these big luxury liners, and German troops are drowned at sea.
The threat posed by Malta was simply too great for the Axis to ignore. An invasion plan was quickly drawn up, and Fort Delimara was suddenly in the firing line.
Hitler sees that Malta is really a burr under the saddle, needs to be removed. And so he actually puts together this thing for 1942 called Operation Hercules.
Marsa-Shlock Harbor would have offered a good place to land because it is a very wide harbor, therefore accommodating several hundreds of vessels at the same time, so it would allow an easy landing of the enemy force.
The Axis planned a combined aerial and amphibious attack. 30,000 paratroopers would drop inland, while 70,000 more troops would arrive to the south on Navy ships. Once the defenses here had been overpowered, the plan was to march north towards Valletta.
The fort here sits at the tip, at the entrance of Marsa-Shlock Harbor. Therefore, any attempted enemy invasion would have to bypass this location in order to gain access. Therefore, the fort was paramount to the defenses of this side of Malta.
The invasion was scheduled to begin in the summer of 1942. All the troops stationed here could do was wait.
The British forces on Malta were always expecting that German invasion to arrive. And at one point, they saw a vessel on the horizon. Everybody was bracing themselves for the bombardment that would surely precede this German fleet.
In August 1942, searchlights of the fort captured the target just outside the harbor, and immediately guns in place here fired against it.
But the target they had sighted was not the feared invasion fleet.
It turned out it was an E-boat, the equivalent of a PT boat, that was outlaying mines in the sea off of Malta. And that gives you an idea of how worried everyone was that any minute on Malta would be the minute before Malta fell. But of course, Malta never fell.
Although Malta had been in the sights of the Axis for a long while, a turn of events on a different front meant that they would never capture it.
Because Hitler gets bogged down in December 1941 at the gates of Moscow, decides he's going to make a turn into the Caucasus in 1942 to try to take the oil fields. Hitler simply doesn't have enough force to deal with Malta, so he just has to let it go.
With the invasion cancelled, Fort Delimara continued to guard the southern shores of Malta until the very end of the war. Twice in its lifetime, it had faced the threat of invasion and had lived to tell the tale. In 1964, the British handed over Malta to the local government, and Fort Delimara went with it. In the Polish countryside are the remains of a place that history has largely forgotten.
We're in a place called Gabin, pretty much in the geographical center of Poland.
Hidden amongst the trees is a central building and a latticed tower.
You get the feeling when all this was built, this was open land. Now the trees have grown up. A young forest has covered a lot of this, hidden some of it.
In the tall grass are the footprints of an engineering giant.
You can see other buildings. You can see concrete pads at some distance away. Clearly, this was a big operation at one time.
It's hard to believe now, but back in the 1970s, this was a high-security location.
It was pretty heavily trafficked, pretty big site, and beside it, all this wreckage of this steel trusses and girders lying in a heap.
These scattered elements add up to a greater whole. But one major piece of the puzzle is missing. Tomasz Miś is part of a group that protects and preserves the site.
We're in central Poland, in a restricted area of high national and military importance. We were allowed to get in, nevertheless, very few people are able to do so.
Today, the building is empty. All that remains is mold, rust, and some solemn reminders of the Cold War.
Yes. Political documents.
But there are signs that it once required an enormous amount of power.
So the site we're currently in was extremely powerful, even for today's standard.
One thing that's fascinating at this site and unusual is that a lot of the electronics are still here. All this stuff looks kind of old and decrepit today, but it was state-of-the-art back in the 80s.
It consumed so much electrical power that a small city could be powered using the thing which came in here.
Outside the main building is a clue to what that much-needed power was for. A concrete anchor, designed for industrial cables, is a common sight at the bottom of these very tall structures.
So this is the foundation of one of the first level guy ropes, which held the mast stem in vertical position.
15 of these anchor points were scattered across the countryside. They were used to hold up the Warsaw radio mast.
What we're looking at here is the site of what was once the most ambitious radio transmitting tower in the world. It's hard to wrap your mind around how tall this thing was, 2,100 feet. This was once the tallest man-made structure in the world.
The tower was designed at a time when Poles were leaving Poland in their thousands.
One thing that's fascinating about Poland is how many Polish people don't live there. They live in all these other places in the world. By one estimate, there are 20 million people of Polish descent around the world.
So after the Second World War, when the borders of Poland changed and many Poles actually emigrated also to the United States, a way of communicating with them was desperately needed.
With such a widespread community, before the advent of the internet, reaching Poles around the world was a massive challenge.
So, in fact, the Poles were looking to set up a radio station in the geographical center of Poland that could reach Poles all around Poland equally, but that was also big enough to transmit to these Polish communities around the globe.
In 1970, construction of a new transmission tower began. Switchboards, transformers, and guardhouses were all vital components. And in 1974, Polish radio was heard around the globe through one of the world's most powerful transmitters.
The engineer who designed it was named Jan Polak. He must have been brilliant. It was designed in 86 sections, all joined together and then anchored to the earth with 15 steel, they call them ropes, cables, that would anchor it in any kind of wind conditions. So when the wind blew, they would correct for each other, they would stabilize it.
The tower stood precisely 2,120 feet tall. Its great height was the key to reaching the most faraway listeners.
They were long wave radio signals. And when I say long, each wave, I mean a literal wave in the atmosphere of electromagnetic radiation was over 1,000 meters. So why would someone want to use those very long wavelengths? Because they tend to follow the curvature of the Earth, and they can travel very, very long distance and still be received. So in the right conditions, signals from this tower could reach Africa, North America, really just about anywhere.
The broadcasts were produced in a studio 60 miles away in Warsaw before being sent via an intermediary tower to this radio transmitter station.
They would transmit locally to a radio receiving tower here near the base of the transmitter. And that's the big metal structure we see that's still standing. I mean, it looks big, but it's puny compared to the transmitter.
This tower is approximately 9 times smaller than the mast that was located on the antenna field. On the top, there is still a dish which received and transmitted signals between the intermediate relay tower and Warsaw. The main purpose of this tower was to collect the signal from the Polish radio studios, so anything, music and speech and all of it, so that it could be later encoded and broadcasted.
Then they would take that signal and then amplify it dramatically, change the wavelength to this long wave system, and then that's the signal that would go around the world.
This engineering giant was Poland's crown jewel. But on the 8th of August 1991, the tallest structure in the world came crashing down.
The mast broke down, twisted, and collapsed onto the antenna field, including the exact place where we are standing.
This tower would have been the tallest structure in the world until the construction of the Burj Khalifa in 2009.
It was 17 years old, so it wasn't that old actually, but in fact it needed a desperate renovation after these 15, 16, 17 years of constant operation.
Building the tallest structure in the communist bloc in Eastern Europe was a pretty dodgy proposition, considering how just poorly things were maintained. They were just known for their shoddy architecture, shoddy maintenance.
So in 1991, an attempt was made to renovate the mast as it was getting older. However, the entire process was done with a couple of major mistakes.
A technician was hired to carry out repairs, but he was unqualified for the job. He detached a major guy rope without adequate support.
The lowest part of the mast fell towards the helix house, destroying it as we can see it here.
Gas lights designed to warn off air traffic smashed onto the ground, starting a fierce fire.
Some of the bottles with gases exploded as the mast fell on them, and a couple of fire brigades needed to extinguish all of this.
All that was left of the tower was a mass of twisted steel and broken glass.
It was nearly impossible to walk through this area because it was all covered with the material coming from the masts.
Nobody's hurt, and yet it is a national scandal. A couple of engineers are jailed for it.
This place where we are here now was left largely intact after the catastrophe took place. So yes, all around we can still find many elements of the mast.
For Poles across the world, Polish radio had fallen silent. An engineering masterpiece gone before its time. Today, it is closed to visitors.
It's probably the biggest and tallest structure on the planet that most people have never heard of.
A landmark in the truest sense of the word, now hidden from view in anonymous Polish countryside. In Scotland, near the ancient city of Edinburgh, is a rock that helped to defend a nation.
We're in northern climes here, and it's an island surrounded by dark, cold water at the entrance of a great estuary.
It's wet, it's cold, it's not a place you want to be spending your summer vacation.
Empty concrete buildings provide reminders of the former residents.
Clearly, a lot of people used to live here, perhaps some kind of commune. But now it's all overgrown. The only sign of civilization are some chickens.
Today, the island is deserted, but less than 100 years ago, it was vital for Scotland's defences.
It's heading into Edinburgh, and any place like that has a defensive role to play.
Two miles out of Edinburgh, a ferry will take you to a place where few people dare to tread. The journey crosses the Firth of Forth, an estuary that leads into the heart of Scotland. Gordon Barclay is an expert on the island history, which involves a wartime tragedy.
This is the northernmost 9.2-inch gun emplacement. There are 3 of them down the spine of the island, and this is the one that covers the North Channel.
This is Inchkeith, the gatekeeper to Scotland's waters. During the First World War, the island was issued with 9 new cannon.
Most of these fortifications are built in the early 1900s, 1903, 1904, 5, 6, 7, as they're responding to these fears of German invasion.
To defend the Firth of Forth, it was made into an impregnable fortress. But that firepower wasn't enough to prevent a disaster.
On the 4th of September, out near the May Island, HMS Pathfinder was sunk, went down in a few minutes, and only a handful of men survived out of over 200 crew.
When these guns were put in place, they were designed to fire on surface vessels, dreadnoughts and destroyers. They weren't built to defend against anything beneath the waves.
The Firth of Forth had been breached. 2 days before the attack, there had been an opportunity to prevent it, but Inchkeith was found wanting.
On the 2nd of September 1914, a U-boat submerged managed to get all the way up to the Forth rail bridge by about 10:30 in the evening.
For ages, it was undetected. And then suddenly, someone spotted a periscope sticking up out of the waves, and the U-boat left the area. 2 days later, that same submarine surfaced just outside of the Firth of Forth and took a shot and sunk HMS Pathfinder. It was the first sinking by a submarine in the First World War of a ship.
The Germans then rely all in World War I on U-boats, submarines, that they can get past the British blockade and they can attack British warships, British shipping covertly.
This island fortress had failed. In 1914, there was only one way to detect enemy submarines.
The only way to detect a submarine was the human eye. Binoculars looking out at the sea, this grey, featureless surface, hour after hour. And if one spotted the wake of a periscope going through the water, you were lucky. Other than that, there was no technology to detect a submarine or indeed to prevent a submarine penetrating a base.
At that time, there was a lot of hysteria about new German weapons. The public were reporting sightings of U-boats left, right, and center. 99% of them ended up being false reports.
Everybody saw a periscope, everybody saw a submarine, so they were just overwhelmed with warnings of German submarines, and so the British came to disregard them. So when the boy actually saw clearly a submarine and reported it, they ignored it.
3 months after the first U-boat attack, the Firth of Forth began a major upgrade. A network of new defenses between the islands were built.
Inchkeith is so important in this anti-submarine war for the British. They begin, first of all, by defending the Firth of Forth with anti-submarine nets that will trap a German submarine trying to come in. Or will attach a buoy to the German submarine so it'll drag this buoy along the surface and we'll be able to know where it is.
But cannon and nets weren't the key to defending Scotland. The most powerful defences were a collection of small huts built to the rear of Inchkeith.
Places like this were vital to the protection of the Firth of Forth. The men on the gun crews, at least, were out in the fresh air, but here you were stuck, hour in, hour out, day out, watching the instruments.
These huts were built on the island as part of a powerful new anti-submarine weapon, the detector loop. A submarine produces a magnetic field from its large steel hull. By laying 3 cables in a loop on the riverbed, its magnetic signature could be detected and a warning signal sent to the guard huts.
The men listening out for an enemy submarine had to be somewhere quiet where they could concentrate, where there would be no noise to drown out or distract them. Here at my feet, you see the outlet of one bundle of cables from detector loops under the river, still there.
For 6 long years during World War II, these huts were never empty. An officer was always on station, waiting for a signal that might never come.
There were multiple layers of defence. A submarine would first be detected passing the Isle of May, and again by the detector loops just east of Inchkeith. Parallel with Inchkeith were the minefields, which, if a submarine was detected entering them, could be exploded. It was pretty impregnable. As far as we're aware, no submarine ever penetrated the defences until the final hours of the Second World War.
On May the 2nd, 1945, the first German regiments in Europe laid down their weapons. They agreed to a total surrender to take place 6 days later. But on the morning of May the 8th, a U-boat crept into the Forth.
2 hours before the end of the war, one U-boat captain attacked a convoy leaving the river out towards the Isle of May and sank 2 ships, killing a number of men.
It was another tragedy for Inchkeith.
German U-boat gets in mainly because the British are napping. They think the war's over. It's the last day of the war, literally.
He claimed that he had not received the order to stand down. He had, however, been one of the officers responsible for developing the new type of submarine that he was commanding. And to my mind, he ignored his orders and decided to try out his new toy, his murderous new toy.
Fort Inchkeith saw the first submarine sinking in World War I and ended its watch with the final sinking of World War II. Now, few people crossed the Forth to visit the island. What was once on the front line in the defence of Scotland is now a safe haven for the wildlife that has reclaimed it.